At Fogg's Hollow the wind blew low across the hills of Fogg's Hollow, carrying with it the scent of earth-old stone, and something else, something long forgotten. Miss Jane Marple sat in the second pew of the little stone chapel, gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. She had arrived in the village, not 2 days earlier, summoned by a letter written on thick curling paper from a solicitor named Mr. Talbot. The funeral she now attended was for Mrs. Lavinia Gould, a distant cousin on her mother's side, so distant that Miss Marple could not quite remember the shape of the woman's face, only that she had once written a very strong letter to the Times about the moral decline of drapery shop displays. The coffin rested at the front of the chapel, draped in lilies. The congregation was sparse, perhaps 15 people in total, a few local villagers, a housekeeper, a farm hand with his cap pressed to his chest, and a pale young woman seated alone in the front pew, dark hair twisted in a shining that had begun to unravel. She hadn't cried once Miss Marple noticed that sort of thing after the brief and dutiful sermon. The vicar, tall and pinched, with a voice like cold water, pronounced the final blessing, and the small group followed the coffin up the hill to the family plot. Fog coiled at the edges of the graveyard, softening the shapes of crooked stones and moss-covered angels. The old cemetery had no gate, nothing kept the dead in. Miss Marple, she turned. Mr. Talbot, the solicitor, offered a slight bow, his brown coat damp at the sleeves. Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure if you still resided in St. Marry Me. I do, Miss Marple replied kindly, but a letter from the Talbots carries weight, and poor Lavinia, well, she and I once shared a love of dams and preserves, if very little else. He smiled faintly, then glanced at the young woman, still standing by the grave. That's Miss Charlotte Gould, Lavinia's great niece. She inherited the house. She only arrived last week. Grew up in Dorset. I believe her parents are no longer living. Miss Marple studied the girl's pale face, the way her eyes flicked not to the coffin, but to the mist curling along the ground. She doesn't look sad, she said quietly. She looks afraid. Fogg's Hollow was one of those English villages that seemed to exist out of time, nestled between ancient hills and thick woodland. It lacked both a post office and a telephone box. The road leading in was barely more than a cart track, and even the cows looked suspicious of strangers. The manor itself, Ash Grove House, stood half hidden behind ivy and trees, its windows like closed eyes. Miss Marple had passed it on her way to the inn, a slate-roofed structure called the Hanging Lantern, whose sign creaked mournfully in the breeze. That evening, by the flickering fire in the common room, she spoke with the innkeeper, a stocky man with sideburns and a fondness for gossip. Strange place, that Ashgrove, he muttered, handing her a cup of tea. Should have been torn down years ago. Place isn't right. In what way? She asked lightly. Oh, you know, curtains twitch when no one's home, lights in the tower room, and no one's lived up there in decades. Then there was the baby, of course. Miss Marple blinked. Baby? I about 12, 13 years ago. Lavinia's sister died sudden. Some say it was childbirth, others not, but a child was born, and after a while it vanished. Lavinia never spoke of it, said it was still born, but folks say otherwise. Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. And no one ever saw the child, not after the first month or so. There were whispers, but Lavinia was a strong one. Shut up the nursery, fired the nurse, and that was that. How peculiar, Miss Marple murmured. The fire popped the next morning. Miss Marple made her way to Ashgrove House. The drive was overgrown, leaves crackling beneath her feet. A crow watched her from a tree branch, head cocked to one side. Charlotte Gould answered the door herself, dressed in a plain cardigan and skirt. Her eyes looked hollow with sleeplessness. You're Miss Marple, she said. I found your name in the solicitor's papers. Your family, please do come in. Ashgrove House was beautiful in the way neglected things often are. High ceilings, faded wallpaper, portraits with cracked gilt frames. Dust lay over every surface like a shroud. The air smelt faintly of lavender and something more bitter beneath. I don't know why I came here, Charlotte admitted, as they sat in the drawing room. I have no memory of Aunt Lavinia. The house gives me the most dreadful feeling. It is quite isolated, Miss Marple agreed gently. Have you explored it yet? Only the main rooms. The upper floors are unnerving. There's a door on the 3rd floor that won't open. It's been nailed shut from the inside. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. From the inside? Yes. Charlotte's fingers trembled slightly around her teacup. Mr. Talbot mentioned the house had no servants for years, but when I arrived the kitchen clock was ticking. Someone wounded. Miss Marple said nothing. She simply listened. That night the storm came. Rain lashed the windows of the Hanging Lantern, and thunder rolled over the hills like God rearranging furniture. At dawn the village woke to the sound of Sirens, 2 police cars crawling up the hill. Toward Ashgrove House, word spread quickly. Charlotte had found a bricked-up wall behind the nursery wardrobe, and within it the skeletal remains of a man's arms, folded a cyanide ring still on one bony finger. The nursery had been sealed for over a decade, and someone had gone to great lengths to ensure it stayed that way. It was not every day that a bricked-up corpse was discovered behind the nursery wall of a country house, yet that was precisely the news that stirred the sleepy heart of Fogg's Hollow on the storm-washed morning following the funeral. Miss Marple arrived at Ashgrove House just after 8 o'clock, umbrella in hand, shoes neatly polished, and an air of quiet determination. She was greeted not by Charlotte Gould this time, but by the uniformed constable stationed at the gates. "I'm family," she said simply, her tone both polite and firm, "and I believe Miss Gould will wish to see me." The constable, overwhelmed by the grandeur of the manor and the strangeness of the morning, nodded without protest. Inside Ashgrove House smelled faintly of wet stone and old secrets. The hallway was crowded now. 2 constables, a detective inspector in a damp mackintosh, and Charlotte herself, seated at the foot of the staircase, with a wool blanket around her shoulders. Her face was pale, her eyes bloodshot, but when she saw Miss Marple, she stood quickly. "It's real," she said. "It wasn't just a bad dream." "I know," Miss Marple said gently. "Tell me everything." "It had begun," Charlotte explained with a simple decision. "I couldn't sleep. That storm last night, it was like something wanted me awake. So I got up and wandered the house. I found myself outside the nursery. The door is warped, but it opens now. Something about the air felt wrong inside." She swallowed hard. "There's an old wardrobe built into the wall. I pushed it aside on a whim. Behind it, I found plaster rough and uneven, not original. I fetched a torch, and that's when I saw the mortar lines fresh compared to the rest. Something told me." She broke off, unable to finish. The Inspector Harwood, a tall man with a soldier's bearing and a face that had forgotten how to smile, cut, and we had it knocked through just before dawn. A shallow enclosure less than a meter deep. A man's remains, clothes mostly decayed, but the ring is intact. He reached into a cloth pouch and pulled out a tarnished gold signet ring embossed with a crest Miss Marple didn't recognize. "No ID. We've sent for dental records, such as they may be. Likely been in there over a decade. And you think he was murdered?" Miss Marple asked softly. Inspector Harwood gave her a look. "People don't usually wall themselves up, madam." "No, indeed they don't," Miss Marple agreed. "But I wonder, did anyone check the ledger in the local parish registry?" Harwood looked surprised. "What for?" Miss Marple smiled ever so slightly. "For someone who was said to have died, but never buried." Later that day, as Harwood and his team combed the nursery and Charlotte rested in her room, Miss Marple took a quiet walk to the village church. The vicar, Reverend Peter Hale, was a mild-mannered man with thinning hair and a nervous energy. Yes, of course," he said, ushering her into his office. "All the burial records are kept here. Now let me see. This would be around 1910 to present." He retrieved the heavy ledger and placed it before her. Miss Marple flipped through the pages with practiced fingers. Deaths, marriages, christenings. Names came and went like echoes. Then she found it here. She said, "Rosamund Gould died 1911, infant." "Ah, yes, very sad," said the vicar. "That was Lavinia's younger sister, wasn't it? Died in childbirth, I believe." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Number, not the mother, the child. There's no record of the mother's death, but she vanished from the records after that." "Date?" The vicar looked confused. "Sometimes people move, indeed they do, but when they vanish entirely from public records, it usually means they were meant to." She thanked him and departed with a heavy heart. Back at the hanging lantern, Miss Marple took a light supper of cold chicken and pickled beetroot. She ate alone, thinking, replaying the facts, as one might rearrange puzzle pieces that don't quite fit a corpse walled up in a nursery, a child officially listed as dead but perhaps not buried, a mother who disappeared, a house with windows that glowed when no one was inside, then a quiet voice behind her. Miss Marple, it was Charlotte. Her face was drawn, but she looked determined. Now she held something in her hand, a folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges. "I found this in the drawer beneath the wardrobe, hidden under a false bottom." Miss Marple unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was elegant, sloping. "If anyone ever reads this, know that I did not kill him out of hatred. He came to take the child away, to destroy her. I could not allow it. Forgive me." There was no signature, but in the corner, smeared with dust, was a faded fingerprint. Miss Marple looked up. It was Rosamund, wasn't it? She lived in secret with the child. Charlotte nodded slowly. and she must have died later unnoticed. Maybe in that sealed room Miss Marple reached across the table and gently took Charlotte's hand, not unnoticed. Not entirely. Someone tried to keep her hidden, yes. But secrets are like bones, they rise to the surface. Eventually that night Charlotte returned to Ashgrove House under police supervision, but Miss Marple lingered at the inn writing quietly in her notebook by candlelight. She was halfway through a sentence when she heard a faint creak, like a floorboard shifting upstairs. She froze. The innkeeper had long since gone to bed. The house was still, and yet another creak. Miss Marple rose, candle in hand, and stepped into the hallway. Shadows stretched long across the wooden floor. The stairwell was empty. And then a whisper, barely audible, childlike. "Don't tell her I'm here." Miss Marple's hand did not tremble. Instead, she climbed the stairs, slowly, carefully, the way one does when approaching the edge of something terribly old. At the top of the landing, the attic door stood slightly ajar. The whisper came again. "Don't tell her." Miss Marple reached for the doorknob. Miss Marple had never believed in ghosts. She believed in guilt and secrets, in the strange distortions that fear could press upon the mind. But as she stood at the top of the staircase, in the dim candlelit hallway of the hanging lantern, a whisper still ringing faintly in her ears, she had to confess there was a coldness on her neck that had nothing to do with drafts. She pushed the attic door open. It groaned on its hinges, like something disturbed. After years of silence, the air that greeted her was dry but stale, heavy with the smell of dust, mothballs, and old paper. She lifted the candle higher. The attic was a long, narrow space with a slanted ceiling. Boxes sat in piles untouched for decades. An old iron crib stood to the left, its mattress long gone. Faded curtains hung limply from a rusted rail. One of them fluttered slightly, though no window was open. Miss Marple stepped forward, each footfall soft on the wooden floorboards. "If someone's here," she said gently, "you needn't be afraid." There was no reply, only silence. She turned toward the curtained alcove. Behind it, nothing but a rocking chair. It creaked softly back and forth. No one sat in it. But something had recently. The next morning brought a thin drizzle in a newspaper headline. No one had expected. Body found in nursery while police investigate identity and motive. A shocking discovery was made yesterday at Ashgrove House, the long-abandoned estate on the edge of Fogg's Hollow. A Bricketon corpse was unearthed by the new heirs. Miss Charlotte Gould. Police have begun a formal inquiry. Charlotte, who had returned briefly to the inn for breakfast, looked pale as she folded the paper. "They'll make a spectacle of it," she murmured. Miss Marple nodded. "That's what papers do. But the truth is seldom found in headlines." Detective Inspector Harwood entered the lounge a few minutes later, brushing rain from his coat. "Good morning, ladies," he said without conviction. "Miss Marple, if you have a moment, I believe we ought to speak privately." They moved to the far end of the room near the fireplace. Harwood's face was drawn, his voice quieter than usual. "The ring," he began, "it belonged to a man named Vincent Langley, a solicitor from Sussex, who disappeared in 1912. He had ties to the Gould family. He represented Lavinia and Rossman's father during an inheritance dispute. There were accusations of blackmail." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And what sort of man was Mr. Langley?" Harwood's lips tightened. "Predatory. He was known to visit young women in compromised situations. It was whispered he had an arrangement with Rossman Gould. There were threats made after the child was born." Miss Marple's gaze grew sharp. "You think he came to take the child to claim paternity? We think he came to control Rosin." To silence her, Miss Marple folded her hands. "And instead she killed him." Harwood exhaled. "So, it would seem then, who helped her seal the wall?" she asked quietly. He looked at her. "That is what we're trying to determine." Miss Marple returned to Ashgrove House. Later that morning, Charlotte was seated in the parlor, sorting through boxes of old correspondence. She looked up as the older woman entered. "I'm trying to piece together the family history," she said, "but so much was destroyed. Lavinia must have burned letters deliberately." Miss Marple sat down across from her. "Charlotte," she said softly, "when you were a child, do you recall anyone unusual? A caretaker, perhaps someone who wasn't officially family?" Charlotte frowned. "Number, but there's a photograph I found yesterday. I didn't recognize the person." She pulled a small image from her cardigan pocket. It showed a woman in her 20s, standing at the foot of the staircase in Ashgrove House. She was strikingly plain, her hair cropped short, wearing a simple blouse and skirt. Behind her, half shadowed, stood a girl of about 7. Charlotte herself, perhaps, but Charlotte shook her head. "I don't remember this woman." Miss Marple studied the image. "Her eyes are very pale." Charlotte nodded. "Almost colorless, like smoke." "May I keep this?" Miss Marple asked. Of course. That afternoon Miss Marple made her way to the post office in the neighboring village of Weedham. Fogg's Hollow had no such amenities, and placed a call to an old acquaintance in Scotland Yard. She requested a background check on Vincent Langley's known associates, particularly any housekeepers or nurses dismissed during the 1910s. By late evening, she had her answer. There had been a nurse, Mrs. Elenina Pace, who had once worked at Ashgrove House. She was dismissed in 1912 after a private disagreement. She had vanished shortly afterward, but there were unconfirmed reports she'd continued to live locally under another name. Miss Marple returned to the inn with a mind full of fog and memory. That night Miss Marple had a dream. She was walking through the nursery, only now it was clean sunlit, filled with the sound of a lullaby. A crib stood in the center of the room. Inside it a baby sleeping peacefully. Then the light changed. The walls cracked. A figure entered the room, faceless and tall shadows spilling across the floor. The baby began to cry. Miss Marple woke with a start. It was still dark. A faint knock echoed from the window. She sat up, heart racing. The window was on the second floor. She crossed the room and pulled back the curtain. No one there, but in the condensation on the glass a single word had been written by a finger. Liar. The next morning Miss Marple requested one thing from Inspector Harwood. I would like to see the bricked room again, the nursery alone, if possible. Harwood hesitated. Why? Because I believe someone hid more than a body there. He granted her access. With 2 constables stationed outside the room, Miss Marple entered with a torch and a pair of gloves. She began with the floorboards, kneeling, tapping, listening near the hearth. One of them sounded different, hollow. She pried it up gently. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with string, was a parcel. Inside were 3 things: a lock of dark hair, a faded christening gown, monogrammed RG, a diary bound in cracked red leather. She opened the first page. March 1912. He says I must give her up. He says she will never be safe while I keep her, but she is mine. I will not let him near her again. Miss Marple closed the diary and stared at the crumbling walls around her. The house had spoken, and it wasn't finished yet. The wind had risen again by the time Miss Marple returned to her room. At the hanging lantern, the red diary clutched carefully beneath her arm, like a sacred text. Outside, fog rolled down the hills, like slow-moving smoke, swallowing the edges of the village, until even the church spire disappeared. She locked her door, drew the curtains, and sat at the writing table, beneath the flickering lamp, with her spectacles perched low on her nose, and her fingers gloved to protect the fragile pages. She opened the diary once more. The ink was faded in places, the hand growing more desperate with each passing entry. March 22nd, 1912. He came again today. Vincent, he threatened to go to the magistrate to claim custody. Said no child should be raised in this house, not by me. I slapped him. He laughed and said he'd come tomorrow with the papers. March 23rd, 1912. I heard him outside the nursery door. I locked it. I placed furniture against it. He shouted, cursed. He called me unfit, called my baby a mistake. I hid in the wardrobe with her. She was quiet, so very quiet. March 24th, 1912. I did it. The fire iron. He bled into the rug. I had no choice. He would have taken her. He would have destroyed her. Elenina helped me. She sealed the wall. We swore never to speak of it again. Lavinia said she would make it all disappear. Miss Marple paused. Elenina, the nurse. She had not vanished. She had been complicit. And Lavinia had known all along. Miss Marple felt a sharp, almost maternal ache. How heavy a secret must have rested on that woman's soul. She turned the page. May 1913. I don't remember the days anymore. Elenina brings food. Lavinia sends up books. I see no one. She grows my daughter, but she does not speak. I think she is afraid, not of me, of the house. The next pages were water-stained, smeared beyond recognition. Then a final entry, faint but intact. July 1914. There is sickness. I am tired. Elenina says she will take the child away to the village. I don't believe her. I think she lies, but I have no strength left. If this is the end, then let her be safe. Let her forget this house. Let her forget me. Miss Marple exhaled. So Rosalind had died. The child had been taken. But where at breakfast Miss Marple found Inspector Harwood pacing the small sitting room, staring through the window into the thickening mist. You were right, he said without greeting. The parish records have no death certificate for Rosalind, no burial either, but there's something else. He handed her a paper, a copied record of employment dated 1915. Elenina Pace, listed as a governess to a private family in Wetcombe. No further address. No employer listed. The trail ended there. I checked census records. Harwood continued. There's no listing for a child under the name. Gould, but there's a girl born 1911, first name unknown, raised by a spinster named Alice, Hensley midwife, by profession. Miss Marple nodded. That was Ella Lenina, a new identity. Harwood looked at her. Then the child survived, yes. And if she did, she would be in her 30s. Now, meaning Miss Marple sipped her tea, meaning she could still be among us. Charlotte Gould, seated by the fire, listened in silence as Miss Marple relayed what she had found. When the older woman finished, Charlotte's eyes brimmed with tears. But she did not speak. Have you never wondered? Miss Marple asked gently, about your own past? Your parents died when you were 6. Yes, but what before then? Charlotte stared at the flames. I remember a room with painted birds on the ceiling, a music box that played something soft. I remember hiding behind a curtain while someone argued in the hall, and a woman with silver buttons on her shoes. Charlotte's breath caught. Yes, Miss Marple leaned forward. My dear, I don't believe Lavinia was your great, and I believe she was your guardian, because the truth was too dangerous. Charlotte's face went pale. Then who was I? Miss Marple looked at her with profound tenderness. You were the child in the wall, not buried, hidden, protected. That afternoon the fog lifted slightly, allowing a narrow shaft of sunlight to reach the upper windows of Ashgrove House. Miss Marple, Harwood, and Charlotte returned to the manor together. The house felt different now, less oppressive, as though the confession had lifted a century of silence. In the attic, where the floor creaked and the shadows clung, they found the final piece, a cedar chest locked, its key long rusted. Harwood forced it open with the back of a spade. Inside, a child's christening certificate. Rose and Gould, mother, father, not listed, a toy rabbit missing one eye, and a single photograph. Rosamond holding the child, smiling. Miss Marple placed the photograph into Charlotte's hands. I knew I'd seen that face, she whispered. You have her eyes. Charlotte stared, her lip trembling. I was never told. Number, because your very existence was dangerous. Lavinia likely raised you as a niece to shield you from questions. Harwood spoke, voice low. And Elena, do we know what happened to her? Miss Marple nodded. She died in 1932. The vicar confirmed it, buried under the name Alice Hensley. Lavinia had the grave marked, simply a faithful friend. That evening back at the inn, Miss Marple sat alone in the lounge, sipping warm milk and gazing into the fire. The mystery had unraveled, not with violence or scandal, but with quiet sorrow. A life protected through silence, a murder born not of rage, but of desperation. The house had whispered, and Miss Marple had listened. She glanced toward the window. The fog had returned, but softer now, like a curtain being drawn over a finished play. Fogg's Hollow was a village built on whispers, old ones buried under stone and ivy, and new ones which rose like steam from teacups and kitchen grates. By the next morning, every resident, from the miller's wife to the butcher's apprentice, had heard that the girl at Ashgrove House was not who they thought she was, but no one knew quite who she was. Either Charlotte Gould, if that was her name at all, sat at the breakfast table of the hanging lantern, poring over the contents of the cedar chest like someone studying the fragments of another woman's life. The child's christening certificate, a silver bracelet engraved CGA lace bonnet, yellowed with time across from her. Miss Marple buttered her toast with quiet focus. So Charlotte murmured, I was raised to lie. Miss Marple glanced up. You were raised in protection. There is a difference. Charlotte looked tired. But it means my name isn't Charlotte Gould. My parents weren't my parents. I don't even know who I am. You are the child of a woman who gave everything to keep you safe. That seems as solid an identity as any. The girl's eyes shimmered with tears, but she did not cry. She folded the lace bonnet and placed it back in the box. Why didn't Lavinia tell me? Miss Marple stirred her tea. Perhaps she meant to, but I suspect she feared what might come of it. Truth, my dear, is often a disruptive thing. It breaks china and rearranges the furniture of the mind. Detective Inspector Harwood arrived just before noon, carrying with him a small leather-bound ledger and a face full of questions. I had our man at the archives dig deeper, he said, setting the book on the parlor table. It's Lavinia's personal household ledger. It was archived with her legal documents. He flipped it open. The entries were handwritten, precise. June 1914, Ella Lenina requests funds for doctor's visit, approved. July 1914, child in poor health. Ella Lenina insists on isolation. August 1914, Ella Lenina moves to Wetcombe. Child goes with her. No contact from Rosin since. Miss Marple's brow furrowed. So Lavinia knew Rosamond had died and allowed Ella Lenina to take the child. Harwood nodded and paid her to do it quietly. Then what happened? Charlotte asked. That's the question. According to the records, Ella Lenina lived modestly for nearly 2 decades, but in 1932, she died suddenly her pneumonia, no mention of what happened to the child afterward. Miss Marple tapped the entry with her gloved finger. There's something missing. If the girl was with Ellalinina all those years, she must have attended school. Someone would have seen her, and Charlotte whispered, unless she wasn't allowed to leave Harwood. Looked up. You mean Ellalinina kept her hidden? Miss Marple's eyes remained fixed on the page number. I think Ellalinina raised her elsewhere, perhaps even gave her a new name, but something frightened her, something enough to return the girl to Lavinia. Later that day, Miss Marple walked the quiet lanes of Fogg's Hollow, with her parasol in hand, visiting each of the older residents. She asked innocent questions about the past, about Lavinia, about the house. Most answered politely. A few dismissed her with pursed lips and half smiles. But one woman, a Miss Bertha Migan, 87, and nearly blind, offered something unexpected. Lavinia's girl, she wheezed, hunched in her parlor chair. She'd come into town once a year, always at Christmas, tall, pale, never spoke much. But she brought lavender sachets to the church, always left them in the last pew. Miss Marple leaned forward. Which year did you? Last year. Miss Migan paused. Must have been 1931, the year before Ellalinina died. And you're quite sure it was Lavinia's girl? I'd wager a lemon sponge on it. That night Miss Marple returned to the church, her steps quiet on the cold stone floor. She made her way to the last pew, kneeling. She ran her hand beneath the wooden bench there. Wedged into a crevice was a sachet dried lavender, faintly scented after all these years, and something more, a scrap of paper tucked inside. You said she would be safe. But she doesn't speak, not even to me. She looks through me, like I'm a stranger. I fear she remembers. I fear I don't know name, no date. But the handwriting matched the red diary. The next morning Charlotte found Miss Marple already dressed, and writing in her small leather notebook. A single page had been torn out and folded on the table. Charlotte picked it up. What's this? Miss Marple looked at her kindly. It's your mother's final entry. I thought you should have it. Charlotte unfolded the page and read in silence. After a moment she said, There's something else, isn't there? You figured out who I am. Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into her handbag and drew out the photograph Charlotte had found earlier, the one with the unfamiliar woman and the little girl. The woman in this photograph was not Rosalind, nor was she Ellalinina. She was someone else entirely, someone Lavinia hired after Ellalinina died. But I don't remember her. Charlotte said. No, Miss Marple replied softly, because she only cared for you briefly, long enough for Lavinia to decide what to do. You were then sent to a school under an assumed name. She handed over another document, an old admissions ledger from a girls' school in Sussex. Name listed Clara Benson, guardian Lavinia Gould. Charlotte stared at it. Clara. Miss Marple touched her arm. You are Rossman's daughter, yes. But your identity was rewritten again and again. Lavinia erased what she feared might resurface. Charlotte stood, her voice trembling. Then, who am I really? Miss Marple looked at her with a gentleness shaped by years of grief and wisdom. You are what she tried to protect. You are the child she loved, hidden in a house that swallowed truth. But now the house has spoken. The fog has lifted as Charlotte returned to Ashgrove House, walking alone beneath the thinning mist. Something in the trees caught her eye. A figure, pale, watching. She turned sharply, but it was gone. Only branches and falling leaves and the faintest scent of lavender. The house creaked like an old ship long moored and forgotten. Ashgrove had always had its moods, walls that sighed, windows that wept condensation even on dry days. But now, with truths untethered and memories disturbed, the house felt watchful. Charlotte moved through it slowly, each step an echo. Since learning her name had once been Clara Benson, she had felt adrift, as though her reflection in the dusty mirror belonged to someone else. Her own face betrayed her. She could no longer tell which features belonged to her and which had been inherited from ghosts. She had returned alone, insisting to Miss Marple that she needed time. The older woman had simply nodded and said, But not silence, my dear. Silence is where old things grow sharp again. Now standing at the top of the staircase in Ashgrove House, Charlotte turned toward the west wing. The part that had long been shut, its hinges rusted, its windows blind with grime. She opened the door. The air beyond it was colder. Meanwhile, Miss Marple had returned to Wetcombe, a quiet purpose in her step. There was one final piece to confirm. The local archives were housed in the back of a disused rectory, maintained by a precise elderly woman with 3 cats and a penchant for peppermints. Miss Marple requested access to employment records between 1931 and 1935, looking for someone in particular. The woman asked a governess Miss Marple replied, hired by Lavinia Gould under a false name. The woman peered over her spectacles. One of those families. It took less than an hour. They're buried in the register. Margaret Elms, employed 1932 to 1934, dismissed abruptly, no reason given. Miss Marple pressed her lips into a thin line. Margaret Elms, a name no one had spoken, but someone still remembered. Back at Ash Grove House, Charlotte entered the west wing with caution. The wallpaper was faded to bone. The smell of mildew hung in the air like a warning. She passed a dressing room, a locked door, then turned into what had once been a study. The fireplace was clogged with ash and bird feathers. Above it, an oil painting of a young woman. Rosalind perhaps stared down at her with blank eyes, and then she noticed the drawer, the lowest one in the desk. It was slightly ajar. Charlotte knelt, heart thudding, and opened it fully. Inside, a pile of letters, all addressed to Lavinia, none opened. She lifted the topmost. 1 August 1933. Miss Gould, you must allow her to see a doctor. She does not eat, does not speak. I have done all I can. I fear for her health. I fear she does not wish to live another November. 1933. You say silence is safest, but silence has made her vanish within herself. She is no longer the girl you brought to me. If you do not act, she will fade. You will lose her completely. The final letter bore no date, just a single line. I have left the girl with the vicar. She is not mine to carry any more. Charlotte's hands trembled. The vicar she had never known. She stumbled to her feet, clutching the bundle of letters, and fled down the hall. Miss Marple was already at the vicarage when Charlotte arrived, breathless and rain-speckled. The vicar, Reverend Hale, seemed startled to see her. I need to ask you something, Charlotte said without preamble. Did a girl very young ever stay here around 1934? Reverend Hale looked confused, then slowly turned to the bookshelf behind his desk. He pulled out a slim, leather-bound journal, his grandfather's. He explained who had served as vicar before him. He leafed through the pages, then paused. There's a line here, he said. It reads, a child brought to the house, left in care, never spoke, taken again by her guardian 3 weeks later. No name, just a child. Miss Marple turned to Charlotte. Someone tried to rescue you briefly, but Lavinia took you back. Charlotte sat heavily in the vicar's armchair. Then it was all true. Miss Marple nodded. All of it. That evening Miss Marple returned to the hanging lantern alone. The folk had returned, thicker, now clinging to the village, like a shroud. She sat by the hearth, wrapped in a shawl, lost in thought. She had almost missed it, the missing name. In all the documents, the diaries, the registers, nowhere was it said that Rosamund had died, only that Elenina had taken the child, only that the girl had returned. But what if the woman who returned wasn't the child? What if the child never left? She rose slowly, her joints aching, and walked out into the night. Charlotte sat in the west parlor of Ashgrove House. Candles lit the letters spread out before her. She stared at the photograph again, the woman with colorless eyes, the child in the shadows. Then she heard it, the creak of a stair, software deliberate. She turned. Hello. No reply. The air grew heavy. She stood and crossed to the door, opening it slowly. The corridor beyond was empty, but down the hallway a faint light glowed from the attic stairwell, and at the top a shadow moved. Charlotte climbed step by step. Miss Marple arrived at Ashgrove House just as the clock in the distant church struck midnight. She let herself in. The door was unlocked, and made her way to the stairs. The fog had crept inside, seeping through every crack she climbed, and at the top, in the attic doorway, she stopped. Charlotte stood frozen in the middle of the room, and across from her, half in shadow, half in light, stood a woman, gray hair, colorless eyes, a face like candle wax. The woman turned slowly to Miss Marple. You shouldn't have come, she said softly. You don't belong to the silence. Miss Marple took a careful breath. You're Margaret Elms. The woman said nothing. Charlotte's voice cracked. I've seen her before, in dreams, always standing beside the crib. She never left, Miss Marple said gently. She stayed behind, hiding, even after Lavinia dismissed her the house. Let her stay. Margaret's voice was barely audible. She promised me the girl would be safe. But the house changes people. You forget what year it is. You forget who you are. Charlotte stepped closer. Then, who am I? Margaret blinked and whispered, you, the girl who never left. In the mirror, silence held the attic like a clenched breath. Miss Marple stood still, a stone at the threshold. Charlotte, eyes wide, faced the pale woman in the shadows. Margaret Elms, whose presence seemed less flesh than memory. Wind scraped the gables outside. The candle on the bureau flickered, as though the room itself had exhaled. You're the girl who never left, Margaret had whispered. Charlotte's voice came out. What does that mean? Margaret looked not at her, but beyond her, through her, as if seeing not the young woman before her, but a specter of the past. I watched you sleep every night. For 3 years, she said you never once called for anyone, not even when you cried. Miss Marple stepped forward gently. You were meant to protect her. I tried, Margaret murmured, but the house was too large, too hungry. It kept secrets. It kept her. Charlotte took a trembling breath. Are you saying I'm not who they said I was? Margaret's expression shifted, softened. You're what's left of her, a shadow that survived. Clara, Charlotte, the names changed, but the house remembered you. It remembered everything. The next morning dawned gray, and sodden fog pressed against the windows of the hanging lantern, like a cat begging entry. Miss Marple sat at the breakfast table, her spoon motionless in a bowl of porridge gone cold. Harwood entered the room moments later, shaking rain from his collar. You'll want to hear this, he said. We found a hidden chamber. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. Another in the west wing behind a false wall. Charlotte led us to it. She said she dreamt of the corridor being longer than it was. He placed a small velvet pouch on the table. Inside, a child's bracelet, a set of hair ribbons, and a journal. Not Rossman's, Clara's. Miss Marple read the first page aloud. My name is Clara. Sometimes Aunt Lavinia calls me Charlotte, but I don't like that name. It's not mine. I live in the house with the crooked hall. There are shadows that don't move. I saw one yesterday. It looked like me. She turned the page. Margaret says I must be good. If I'm good, the house won't notice me. If I'm bad, it cacks louder. I try not to make it creep. Miss Marple sat back in her chair. The child never left. She said softly, they thought they sent her away, gave her a new name, a new life, but something stayed behind, some part of her. Harwood frowned. Are you saying Charlotte isn't the girl but the echo? No, she said. I'm saying Charlotte is the girl, but parts of her were sealed away like the rooms in Ashgrove, walled off, forgotten. Charlotte stood in the west wing once more, this time alone. She faced the tall mirror at the end of the hall, framed in oak, warped at the edges. The mirror had hung there for as long as she could remember, or perhaps longer than that. She stepped closer. Her reflection wavered slightly. She reached out her hand, and for a fleeting second the girl, who looked back, was not herself, smaller, sadder, wearing an old-fashioned ribbon in her hair. Charlotte gasped. The image blinked and vanished. Miss Marple and Inspector Harwood returned to Ashgrove House at dusk. Charlotte met them at the door. She looked different, as if she had crossed an invisible threshold. Her voice was steady but distant. I found a box in the floorboards of my old room, she said. Inside it was a necklace with the initials R.G. Miss Marple took it gently. Rossman Gould. Charlotte nodded. I think it was given to me before everything was sealed away. She led them upstairs, in the nursery, now cleared and aired. The rocking chair still sat in the corner, unmoving for once. On the mantel, Miss Marple noticed a fresh lavender satch. Did you place that? She asked. Charlotte shook her head. It was already there when I came in. Inspector Harwood's voice was cautious. Miss Marple, are you suggesting this house holds more than secrets, that it's not haunted? She interrupted, but haunted by memory. Some places absorb pain, others, they echo it. She turned to Charlotte. You were never mad, never broken. You were fragmented, but now the pieces are aligning. That evening Miss Marple walked once more through the winding lanes of Fogg's Hollow. She thought of Rosin, buried in silence, of Ella Lenina, who kept her oath until the very end, of Lavinia, whose efforts to preserve family honor had built a prison out of protection, and of Charlotte Clara, who had lived her entire life inside a jigsaw no one knew how to finish. But now the picture was forming, and though edges remained blurred, it was enough. When she returned to the inn, there was a note waiting for her at the front desk. It read, "Thank you. I remember the birds on the ceiling now, and the smell of lilac in the spring. I'm not afraid anymore." See, Miss Marple smiled. She would leave tomorrow. The fog would not, but it no longer frightened the girl in the house. The morning Miss Marple was to leave Fogg's Hollow, the sun broke through. It arrived not with fanfare, but as a slow golden unraveling of mist. The trees, once blurred by fog, reappeared as real things, mossy-rooted. Still, the windows of Ashgrove House glittered faintly through the distance, like mirrors, tilted toward the light. For the first time in years, she stood outside, the hanging lantern, carpet bag in hand, coat buttoned high. Charlotte, no Clara, she now allowed herself to be called, waited beside her. I suppose you'll be glad to leave, Clara said softly. Miss Marple shook her head, not glad, but satisfied. That's rare, you know. They shared a moment of silence as two crows passed overhead, wings slicing the brightening air. I'm not sure what I'll do now, Clara admitted. The solicitor says the estate's mine. I could sell it, burn it down, or stay. Miss Marple studied her face. There was still a trace of sadness there, but beneath it something stronger, an awareness that hadn't been there before. You must do what the house never could. Miss Marple said, move on. Clara smiled faintly. It still cacks at night. They all do, my dear, especially the ones that have finally stopped whispering. Detective Inspector Harwood gave Miss Marple a lift to the station. He was quiet on the drive, hand steady on the wheel, eyes fixed ahead. But just as they reached the edge of the village, he said, I filed my report. It will list Vincent Langley's death as manslaughter, a closed case. Rossman defended herself, and Ella Lenina concealed the body. Lavinia covered it all for the child's sake. Miss Marple nodded. He added, the Home Office may never pursue it further. It's ancient history. Now history doesn't stay buried. She replied, only ignored. He gave her a sidelong glance, and Margaret Elms. Miss Marple smiled faintly. She's gone like smoke. He raised an eyebrow. You don't believe she was a ghost? I don't think she knew what she was. Some people live too long with secrets. They forget how to be anything else. They reached the station. Harwood helped her down with an awkward courtesy. You're quite something, he said. Most women your age knit and gossip. Miss Marple gave him a bright, innocent smile. I do both and solve murders. Back in St. Marry me. Spring had come. Early daffodils lined the path to Miss Marple's cottage, and the postman tipped his cap as he passed. In the quiet warmth of her parlor, she resumed her knitting, but the needles moved a little slower. Now her mind still traveled through mist and memory. That evening, she received a letter. It was written in a neat, precise hand on thick paper. The envelope bore no return address. Dear Miss Marple, the house has settled. I sleep now deeply and without dreams. The west wing is open. The nursery is filled with sunlight. Sometimes I sit in it and read aloud, not to anyone, just to the walls. I think they like it. I found more pieces of myself. I found my old drawings pressed between the floorboards like dried flowers. I found the lullaby Rossman used to hum. It came back to me while washing dishes. I hum it now too. Thank you for showing me the girl in the mirror. Wasn't gone, just waiting. Yours, Clara. Miss Marple folded the letter, pressed it between the pages of her gardening book, and smiled. Epilogue. Some months later, Fogg's Hollow was still foggy. Asheville House still creaked, but the villagers noticed something peculiar. The house was no longer shuttered. Its garden, once overgrown, now bloomed with wild flowers, and on certain mornings, if one walked up the hill, one might hear music from an open window, a piano slightly out of tune, a woman's voice reading aloud, laughter, and once a lullaby. No one knew quite what had happened in the house beyond the fog, but the children said it was a place that remembered things.